open a few months ago, and it blew my mind. And then I got the email and social media for this, and I didn't hesitate to sign up. So,
awesome. So where are you from?
Tacoma.
Oh, very nice. Welcome. Okay, who's been to all 5? See, there's not like an insignificant number of us. So I'm going to come back, actually. Do you mind speaking, Joe? I want to know why you come back every year.
Well, like you said, this is like my favorite weekend every year because it's my pain family reunion, and I love seeing the people who come year after year, and then all the new faces too. And when the people come to life from your social media and your phone and your computer, like that's the coolest thing when you meet someone in person for the first time that you've been interacting with sometimes for years before you actually meet them in person. And then of course all of the speakers are always amazing, but it's interacting with the attendees that is my favorite part.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. All right, does anyone else want to tell us why they come back year after year? Awesome. I'm super excited that Sandy got me a Band-Aid for my foot because I wouldn't be getting around so good. All right, so what keeps you coming back year after year, Jody?
Well, let's see. I'm a massage therapist. I've been practicing for over 31 years. I found out about 4 years ago that I was bored out of my mind and kind of disillusioned. Somehow I got together with Rajam and ended up here. This is my 3rd summit. I'm not sure if I prefer the people more or the material or both, but the people I've met here, the friends I've made, the colleagues I've made, even seeing somebody once or twice a year has been amazing. And this is my tribe. So I'm really glad to be here.
Well, thank you. So I love hearing those stories because I've been back 5 times, and to be perfectly honest, I didn't even know that this was happening until Sandy Hilton said, Lorimer's speaking at this thing, we've got to go. And we went, and let you know, like lives change. And so hopefully, after the next 2 days, you feel really awesome, and you tell your friends, because what would be awesome would be to see this grow and to like have to need the bigger room. It won't ever be too big, I don't think. I think it would lose a little something. But having a room full of people who want to do better for the people they're helping is really, really, it's very heartwarming. Okay, so we're still waiting. We have some spirit fingers in the back. Okay, let's do this, geography. Okay, so I think there's a couple Canadians here, I'm not sure. And I think that's one of the fun things, is that this is actually an international conference. I mean, anyone from not North America? Yay! See, so we have people from all over the world. Where are the places? So I know we have a New Zealand. Yeah? And then where else do we have? Australia? Awesome. Austria? Welcome. Denmark? Hi. I was just in Copenhagen. I like it in Denmark. Yeah. Finland? Awesome. Wow. Israel? Okay, so I literally have goosebumps right now. Because, you know, sometimes you go to conferences and what I've learned is if you just go to like an American conference, so I mean, I go to PT conferences often, and when you start to go to places where you all practice in the same healthcare system and you have some of the same struggles, sometimes you can talk things out. But also sometimes you realize, oh my gosh, I'm kind of in a box. Like, why am I choosing the things I'm choosing to do with people? And you realize it's more of a system thing or an education thing. So when we get people from all over the world, it's so much more fun. It just makes my brain think a little bit differently and outside of the box. So I wish I had a prize to give for the people who came the furthest, but also I'd have to Google stuff because I only know distances from Chicago. So, all right. What was that? Yeah, how many from Chicago? Why don't we hang out more? I'm just curious. I mean, you don't have to say it out loud right now, but the weather is better here, to be fair. But it's not terrible in Chicago right now. Actually, it's like 40s, sweater weather. Oh, that's a good idea. Okay, so how many massage therapists, RMTs, massage therapists do we have? Okay, it's kind of funny, not quite as many as I expected. Okay, hands down. How about physios? Okay, about equal, actually, I think. OTs? Yes. Okay, how about structural integrationists or Rolfers? Okay, we got some of you. Awesome. I feel like you guys used to be a bigger group. I don't know what happened. I don't know. Did we scare them away, do you think? I don't know. Well, I'm happy you guys keep coming. Okay, did I miss anyone? Awesome. Thank you for coming. There needs to be more of you in pain management. Awesome. Chiropractors. All right, and yes. Physicians. Do we have That's great. How many physicians this year? Thank you for coming. You're all by yourself. Oh, 2 physician or a movement educator. Awesome. Thank you. Welcome. Did I miss anyone? We have 1 psychologist over there. Yeah, 2. Oh, 2. Oh, hi. Okay, so that is also the fun of coming to a conference, I think, that is focused on pain, because we understand that it's biopsychosocial. We understand that there's a lot to this. And so as a physical therapist, oh gosh, is that me? I just heard someone laugh really loud. But is people think all we do is physical things, but like we really can't separate it out, but also I'm not good at everything. Right? So like I need my mental health people, I need my OTs, I need even occasionally chiropractor. I'm friends with Richard, so I can say that. But really, it does take a team, and this is one of the few conferences I go to where that is really like the theme that is woven throughout is that we're all just helping people. Hey, Rajam, should I start the intro or not yet? Okay, so should I start reading? Okay, I'll read slowly, unless you think he wants to hear it all. Oh, well, in that case, Nikki Lee, she was here, and she left again. Can you pop back in, Nikki, and we'll... No, that's not her. No. Thanks, Mark. There she is. Questions, concerns. The lovely Nikki Lee. So she's the person you ask questions to because I don't know that much. Okay, I'm going to start slowly reading because actually it's quite impressive and it's quite long. Professor Antonio Damasio's, oh, there he is, bio. Maybe we'll wait so you can hear it. Okay. Is it okay if I go ahead and start, Rajam? Okay. All right. So Professor Antonio Damasio is the David Dornsife Professor of Neuroscience, Professor of Psychology, Professor of Philosophy, and Director of the Brain Creativity Institute at the University of Southern California. And he's also an adjunct professor at the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California. Professor Damasio has made seminal contributions to the understanding of brain processes, underlying emotions, feelings, decision-making, and consciousness. He is the author of numerous scientific articles. His Google Scholar H index is 144 over 129,000 citations. And his research has received continuous federal funding for over 30 years. He is the recipient of many awards, including the Grawemeyer Award in 2014, the Honda Prize in 2010, the Asturias Prize in Science and Technology in 2005, and the Signore Prize in 2004, which he shared with his wife, Hannah Damasio. Professor Damasio is a member of the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Bavarian Academy of Sciences, and the European Academy of Sciences and Arts. He has been named a highly cited researcher by the Institute for Scientific Information and also holds honorary doctorates from several universities. He has described his discoveries in several books: Descartes' Error, The Feeling of What Happens, Looking for Spinoza, and Self Comes to Mind. And those books have been translated and taught in universities worldwide. So I'm honored to present Professor Damasio. And if you look, you have little brain candies. So that's in honor of all of the brain information that we're going to be getting. And so feel free to eat it now or save it for later.
So good morning, pleasure to be here. Beautiful weather, except it's cold. This is really, really, really cold. You know, I was in Paris last week and it was warmer than this. So that's something. When we get to this in California, we're in trouble. Let me start. The title of my lecture, as you can see there, is about the physiology of feeling, and that's what I'm really going to talk about. Is about very distinct progress that we have made with the concept of feeling, and I'm going to make a distinction with the concept of emotion. These are all things that are absolutely essential for those of you who are working with pain. In fact, if one wants a definition of feeling, anywhere you look, pain is one of the ways to start. By the way, can you hear me in the back? Good, okay. I have a bit of a cold and I want to make sure. So let me start by saying the following. When I think about how to define pain, I was preparing this lecture for you and I was thinking about how I would define pain today. Because obviously for a good part of my career, I have been interested in aspects of pain or pleasure and different aspects of affect. And I was looking for a definition that I would concur with today. And there you have it, pain as a biological process engaged by dysfunction or injury to body tissues. This is about as succinct as one can get to a definition of this process, and I emphasize both dysfunction or injury because you obviously can have pain even if you don't have a wound in the proper sense, and you just have a process of changes of tissues, so you don't need to be at the wound point to produce pain. And of course it has to do with body tissues. Now, of course, some of you might say to me, well, what about the pain I feel if I am disappointed in love, or if I lose a loved one? And that's, of course, pain as well. But it is pain that is drawn through psychological processes from the kind of pain that we can feel biologically. So that's the heart of the matter, is that pain has to do with injury or dysfunction in body tissues, and every creature that is alive has a body, so it starts from there. Next, what does pain cause? As a set of signals, as a state. It causes, in the very least, protective actions. For example, abrupt suspension of activities. If you get pain, all of a sudden, you stop on your tracks. It creates local or widespread muscular contractions. It's one of the very common consequences of pain. It changes your attention system because it directs attention in a very, very concentrated way towards the source or the possible source of pain. And it produces an engagement of very defensive mechanisms at molecular level. So it really is a multi-tiered process of consequences. And when you look at this, the first thing that really comes to mind, and in treating pain in general as a phenomenon, is that pain is an extremely protective process. Pain, sometimes one says that pleasure makes the world go round, but so does pain. Pain is a signal that gives you incredibly important warnings that are very, very key to your survival. But pain is also a teaching signal. It's also a way to allow you to learn that there are certain things that are going to be destructive for you and that there are things that you have to avoid. So it is of an extremely deep importance to living creatures of every level, not just living creatures that are thinking and complex like we are, but to any kind of creature that has access to the pain signal itself, which is something that we can talk about, because I doubt that all creatures have access to pain, although they may have access to the precursors of pain. Now, the process that I've just described is translated in the case of humans, of course, and in the case of many other thinking animals, is translated in a valenced mental experience, which is a negative feeling. And I have a couple of words that are highlighted there so that I can make comments about them. So this is a process of translation. So you have this physiological process that starts, for example, with a cut or with a major bleeding wound, say, in your gut. And you translate it mentally. That's absolutely key. And it's also absolutely key that we see this in a modern way of looking at minds and brains and organisms in general, is that minds are the parts of organisms that have this peculiar presentation, which is mental and which allows us to think about in a very conscious way. But there are other aspects in the fact that you have a mind and you have mental experiences doesn't make mind separate from bodies or separate from physiology. It's simply the part of our physiology that has to do with mental representations. But there's that word there, valenced, which is key because, there are plenty of things that we do mentally that we can talk about in terms of our cognition that do not have a valence per se. They are not to be judged as pleasant or unpleasant, as good or bad, as having any kind of affective resonance. But pain does. And so pain is a very, very startling and important and fundamental aspect of a valenced mental state. And this mental experience, this valenced mental state, which is valence because it can be positive or negative, in the case of pain is negative, and it is a feeling. And that's why I'm going through all this for you to connect you with the physiology of feeling so that you don't think that learning more about the physiology of feeling is something that is not important for all those of you that are doing very important work in terms of treating pain, in terms of helping people that are suffering with pain syndromes, because they are suffering. Why? Because they have feelings, otherwise they wouldn't. So this is absolutely critical. This is fundamental to the kind of activity that you do. Now, what is a feeling? Feeling is the critical piece in a collection of processes that includes drives, motivations, and emotions. And the term affect is a term, sort of an umbrella term, to cover drives, motivations, and emotions. And affect really respects all of them. But one thing that I'm going to insist on, and that of course my talk is aimed at, is to make this fundamental distinction between what you feel and what you emote on. When you emote, the very term emotion is pointing you in the direction of something very important. There is movement, there is action. Emotions are phenomena about action sequences, whether they're actions at the molecular level or actions in the movements we make or an animal makes. They are actions through and through. And there's no guarantee when you have an emotive response that that emotive response is going to be translated mentally into a feeling. So when we talk about a feeling, and of course pain is through and through a feeling, you're talking about something that has repercussions mentally. The mental experience is changed, is a different experience. And one reason why this is important is that when you look in evolution, you find a number of creatures that clearly emote, but there's no reason for us to suspect, although we cannot guarantee, that they have feelings as well. So you can have in nature creatures that emote and that appear to be pleased or displeased in terms of the reaction they have motorically, and yet we don't know that they have mind enough, or even mind at all, to feel the correspondent state. So that's why it's so important to deal with this distinction, and that's why what you're doing, you need to know that you're not just dealing with emotive processes, you're dealing with emotive processes and their consequences in terms of feeling. Okay, to address the biology of feelings, we need to consider their evolutionary antecedents in non-human species. It's a little bit of what I just told you. If you don't consider this in an evolutionary way, you have no way of making this separation. And it's very interesting that there is a very strange order in which these biological developments occur. So if you read through this, you'll get the picture very rapidly. All living creatures exist, act, and behave. This is true of single-cell organisms and all multicellular organisms, including plants. So to say that something is alive and exists and acts and behaves, does things, is true of every living creature, no matter how small or how big. And it's even true of plants, because plants, although most of the time we think of them as immobile and they have very poor motion devices, even plants move. And as you know, there are plenty of plants that exhibit motions, for example, as the time of day changes and as circumstances change. So this is general for living creatures. All living creatures share the imperative of regulating their life process such that life can persist, flourish, and project itself into the future. And this is what is called homeostasis. And it's very important that you, as people that deal with pain, put pain in the right biological perspective. Pain is part and parcel of the mechanisms of regulating life, because if you didn't have the pain signal available to an individual, so that that individual can, by herself or himself, or with the help of another like you, deal with pain, those individuals would die. So homeostasis, the very strange word that talks about life regulation, is critical for you to place the phenomenon of pain in the right biological perspective. Okay? And I want to say, just as an aside, that homeostasis is not a simple functional equilibrium. It's something more complicated that sort of pushes life into the future, pushes life in the forward direction. And the goals of homeostasis are immediate life regulation, such as energy procurement, metabolism, maintaining the integrity of the soma, and it's under that the issue of pain is so looming, social regulation, and ensuring of species continuation. In simple organisms, homeostasis is achieved by the precursors of endocrine, immune, and circulatory systems. So this is something that may come as news for some of you, the idea that we have been regulating life throughout evolution long before there were nervous systems. But endocrine systems, immune systems, and circulation in some of the creatures were enough to keep you on track and to maintain the regulation of life. And the great novelty that comes towards us, but comes from creatures that began existing 500 million years ago, is that some of them have nervous systems, as is the case with us. Once you have nervous systems, eventually you're going to have access to a mind, because you're going to have mental experiences, and you're going to deal with those mental experiences with some fundamentals that have to do with pain and pleasure, and that allow you to regulate life in a novel and better way. So when sometimes you will hear people say, well, pain is a primitive signal, is something very basic. Well, it's true that it's basic and primitive, but it's extremely important. And it is one of the fundamentals that regulates the intelligence of creatures and that allows creatures to behave in an appropriate way and learn in appropriate ways and become better and ensure their survival. And if you don't have that primitive signal available, you're really going to die very quickly. So it's when somebody tells you that pain is not, or pleasure are not about the great human intelligence, well, here's news for those people, is that that is the beginning of intelligence. True intelligence begins with the governance that we institute on the basis of those signals that we have available. Okay, so just to complete the thought that in complex organisms such as we are, homeostasis requires nervous systems which coordinate the operations of all other systems and which butt into mental processes. So why do the nervous systems, why are they so important? And by the way, the pain experience, as we were talking about, can only be had, as far as we know, by creatures like us that have nervous systems. But what the nervous system allows us to act more exactly and eventually to be conscious of some of the actions and behaviors and to have subjective mental experiences. We can skip this one. So in humans, homeostasis is achieved by action programs. I told you a little bit about that at the beginning. The basic actions are those of molecules that target certain receptors in the body proper and the nervous system, for example, endogenous opioids. Other actions are carried out by muscles, smooth or striated, and those basic action programs solve complex problems with standard but elaborate responses that do not necessarily require a mind. These programs are, to begin with, preset, innate, instinctual, but then learning can expand their scope. The main action programs that we have, of course, include drives, motivations, and emotions, such as appetites, food, drink, sex, exploration, play, attachment to caregivers, and so forth. And some action programs are spontaneously engaged by life processes, others are provoked by specific circumstances. Now, the mental experience of the action programs and of their results is known as feelings, and feelings are necessarily valenced and conscious. So we're sort of coming around to some of the first words I told you, that feelings have a necessary valence, and there's something that is attached to feeling which is critical, and of course very critical in the case of pain, is that they're conscious. It's not something that can be working only in the background. It's something that you are conscious of. And of course, if you have a feeling that is negative in valence and such as pain, and you are conscious of it, you have a real problem, because the unpleasantness that is associated with pain needs to be dealt with. And obviously the creature that is suffering through that, human or not, has to engage a variety of programs and a variety of inventions to stay away from that maintained unpleasantness. And again, what you as professionals do is engaging with that problem and reducing that problem for the individual that is suffering pain. Under number 5, you see that feelings constitute natural reports to the mind on the state of life within the organism. And again, at the beginning, I referred in passing to pain that comes not because of a physical injury, but because of a mental state connected, for example, with your social life. And let me reiterate that, because when I say that feelings constitute natural reports to the mind on the state of life within the organism, when you have somebody that reports pain that is not of an apparent physical origin, and you have the pain that comes from loss of another loved individual, what you're reporting still comes under 5. You're reporting a state of dysfunction in the organism, because that's exactly what depression will do. That's exactly what an acute syndrome of loss can do to you. You may be apparently physically healthy, and yet you're not, because you have engaged a variety of molecular mechanisms and of neural mechanisms that are bringing down the homeostasis of the organism and are, in fact, compromising the future of that living tissue, the future of that living organism. And that, once again, is expressed as pain. So if people ask you, well, is the pain of loss different from the pain of a wound produced by a knife? The answer is not really. The mechanisms are still the same. The deep mechanisms, the mechanisms that are immediate, of course, are not the same. But in the end, what pain is telling you is about dysfunction in a living organism, and is telling you, watch out, if you continue this way, it's not going to end up well. So that's basically the same mechanism. So what next? I'm going to skip telling you in detail about emotions. I'm sure you know quite a lot about that. But I want to tell you a little bit about the neural basis of emotions, and tell you that the command units for the execution of action programs that constitute emotions are located in specific subcortical brain regions. And the reason why I want to emphasize this is that, again, these regions are also very much related either to the production of pleasure or the production of pain. So I've outlined a few there: the periaqueductal gray, the amygdala nuclei, the nucleus accumbens, and the ventral pallidum, and the hypothalamus, which for a variety of reasons runs our endocrine system and works together with those other structures. And first thing to say is that they are subcortical. So people spend quite a lot of time paying attention in terms of the human mind, paying attention to the cerebral cortex, as if the cerebral cortex were the be-all and end-all of our mental life. And that's simply not the case. It's obvious that a lot of what is most complex about a human mind requires the cerebral cortex, but it is not true that the cerebral cortex alone could ever produce the kinds of minds, the kinds of operations that we can produce individually. And we can, as human beings, we can have great, great complexity. And it's also true that for affect, for processes that have to do with emotions or feelings or drives, the truth is actually the reverse, is that it is the subcortical units that are most important to produce those behaviors, those phenomena, and the cortex ends up being the last resort where some of the things are represented. So, for example, in relation to human feelings, the insular cortex is very important, and I'll show you some images of the structure in a second. But that's not where the process begins. Where the actions begin that end up producing a certain emotion and that ends up being felt as feeling begins all in the brainstem. And the cerebral cortex is involved, but it's the last one to be involved in the process. So let's see what else I've got here to show you. Okay, so that's a very beautiful slide. It's a human image, of course, done with modern neuroimaging. And I have pointed out with the arrows these different structures. So you can see here the periaqueductal gray. This is an extremely, you can see how this is done. It's a cut that comes this way, okay? And so cuts both hemispheres and then cuts through the brainstem. And here in the brainstem, you see the periaqueductal gray. So it's gray nuclei that are all sort of regimented around the aqueduct, which is a tubular structure where you have a CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, going. And this structure is key to a variety of emotional processes, and we know now that there are nuclei in the periaqueductal gray that are active when there is pain. So if you have pain, and especially if you have pain that is unexpected, which is the pain that is of most value in terms of governing our behavior, these structures are the ones that come alive, okay? So that's important to know. Here you have amygdala, and this is a big collection of nuclei, sort of a big sphere on each side of these, for each hemisphere, sort of in the inner temporal lobe. And these structures, these nuclei in the amygdala, are very involved in relation to one very important emotion, which is fear, but they're also very active during pain. So pain is very critically related to these subcortical structures. On the other hand, just to give the contrast, here you have a structure called the nucleus accumbens, and the nucleus accumbens has nothing much to do with pain. It has to do a lot with pleasure. So you have the sort of opposite end of the spectrum where you have responses that are felt as pleasurable and which very often are being used naturally to counteract the responses that produced pain. Okay. So I'm going to show you a couple of images here of the cerebral cortex, just to, of course, in the previous images that I showed you, the brainstem was here, and the structures that I was referring to, such as the periaqueductal gray, are right here, and the structures such as the amygdala that I referred to are underneath these structures here in the temporal lobe, okay? But they're all subcortical. Now, you have this vast amount of tissue in the cerebral cortex, and of course it is very important, and it is the tissue that is responsible for your fine perception of the world. So everything that is going on that you perceive visually, auditorily, that you perceive by touch and smell and so forth, is arranged thanks, and you obtain it thanks to structures in the cerebral cortex distributed all around the cortical mantle in specific regions. It's also, the cerebral cortex is also the territory that is giving you the possibility of memorizing stuff. So you have visual experiences, for example, and you're going to have the memory of those visual experiences thanks to structures in the cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex is also going to do something very important, which is allow you to manipulate images, whether they are current, perceptual, or images that you pull back from your memory. You're going to manipulate them in the process of reasoning. So it's not that the cerebral cortex is not important. It's very important because you cannot have perception, you cannot have reasoning, you cannot have memory processes, you cannot have creative invention, for example, if you do not have the cerebral cortex. It's just that these levers of pain and pleasure, which are so critical, do not begin at the cerebral cortex. They're processes that, because they're so old in evolution, so old in the evolution of life and in the evolution of nervous systems, they are located and they depend on structures that are lower down in the overall schema of the nervous system. So it's just a question of putting this in the right perspective. It's not trying to favor subcortex or cortex, not at all. Okay. This is an image that I think some of you, does anybody know that image? Good, a couple of people that do. But it's an image that it's useful because when you think about the emotions that you can have, and the count of emotions, of human emotions in particular, varies between anywhere from 6 or 7 fundamental emotions to about 20 to 30 emotions if we count them all in the subtle variations. But this is something that is interesting to call attention to the fact that emotion and the corresponding feelings are so connected to the body, are so much expressions of the state of the body. And this is a study that was done in Finland, where very simply with fundamental basic materials, you looked at what people, perfectly normal volunteers, felt in relation to certain emotions, in relation to the state of their body, by coloring in a body schema, coloring what they thought was most active, where there was activity and where they felt it was related to that particular emotion. And what you see very clearly is that there is activity throughout the body, but that activity concentrates on the torso, concentrates on chest and abdomen, and then in the head to a certain degree. And of course, this is all the stuff that also corresponds to the very heart of our viscera. So it's in these regions that most of our viscera are located, and most of what you describe as emotions is really a variation in the state of operation of those viscera, including, the largest of all the viscera, which is our blood circulation in the skin. The skin is one of the viscous, and it is there too that so much of our emotion is expressed, as you know, when you, for example, when you blush or when you are pale with fear and so forth. So what we then create as feeling of those emotional states, all the way from states of pain and fear to states of great pleasure, what we do is represent mentally through the operation of images what is going on in our bodies. So when if somebody asks you to give a quick definition of feeling, here's what I suggest you do. First thing you do is say, feelings are not emotions. Feelings are the result of the state of operations of our bodies, and sometimes they are the result of emotions. Okay, so they can either be homeostatic feelings or feelings of emotions. And then they are the image representation of the state of our physiology. And sometimes they are very, very sharply related to an organ. For example, if you are hungry, one of the things that can happen if you're hungry is that you are actually picturing the state of your stomach and gut as something where something is lacking. And it's being pictured mentally. And that is, it's just that people for a long time did not realize, were so taken by the images of the outside world that people did not realize that feelings are images of our inner world. So we carry that world with us. And when we image that world, we have a feeling. And that feeling is being produced by homeostatic changes in the body or by some other provocation, such as producing fear in ourselves or producing pain. Okay? Very good. In brief, the results of deploying an action program are represented within the brain sectors concerned with surveying the state of his own body. Feelings hinge on that representation. The body state representations depend on signals that are conveyed to the central nervous system via humoral routes, peripheral nervous system, or the enteric nervous system. This is very important for you to know, because for a long time people thought, well, it was just the peripheral nervous system that did it. It was interoception in the plain way. Now we know that a lot of the signals that serve as the base for our feelings are just chemical. The molecules that are floating and that end up picked up by the nervous system. So you don't need to have a nerve that tells you about a certain state. And the other is that the peripheral nervous system has a big companion, which is the enteric nervous system. So the nervous system that is within our gut is a very particular nervous system for one very important reason. It's the first of the nervous systems. So when you consider evolutionarily where the nervous system started was not in our beautiful cerebral cortex. It started around the gut. So it's something that people have a lot of trouble thinking through, but let's be humble and say we started around our guts. And then we evolved in a very nice way all the way up to our cortex. Okay, that picture is just there to remind me to tell you one thing that you may not find very important, but I find fascinating, and it's a lot of work on our lab is now around this, is that in order to generate feelings, including the feelings of pain, you need to use when you use the nervous system, you make special use of the part of the nervous system that does not have myelin around the axons. So what I showed here is nervous systems fibers that have myelin. The myelin is represented by the yellow ovals. And here are fibers that do not have myelin. The reason why this is very important is that practically all the fibers that come from our viscera, for example, our guts, our lungs, and so forth, all of that is unmyelinated. They're very, very old fibers, which means that the axons are at the mercy of the molecules that are in the surrounding space. And so the influence of the body itself into the nervous system is massive. Whereas in the more modern nervous system, the fibers that come from the periphery, like for example the fibers that come from our muscles, those fibers are insulated by myelin, so they're much less vulnerable to the chemicals that are circulating around those fibers, okay? So this is just a little bit for you to know about that, but it's not critical. And we can skip that. And we can skip that. This is just to give you an idea of the incredibly complicated levels of projection of signals coming from the body into the nervous system. So you have the levels here, spinal cord, hypothalamus, thalamus, cerebral cortex. And then you have how those signals can have a very complex mixing and intermixing at the level of brainstem and hypothalamus, and then further how they go into the insular cortex. So they do go into the insular cortex, but after they have been doing all sorts of fun things in the brainstem and thalamus. This is something for those of you who may listen to me and say, well, he was protecting the brainstem and talking a lot about the brainstem when you have this gigantic cerebral cortex that is so important. True, but if you think that the brainstem is not important, just look at the nuclei that you have in the brainstem contained within just a few millimeters. This is about the human brainstem. And you have all of these different nuclei. So it's a world that exists out there with different autonomous pieces that some of which interact and which form a world of itself. So of course it's not as expanded as the world that you have in the cerebral cortex, but it is of an incredible complexity. Some of the critical partners in this, I mentioned the periaqueductal gray a while ago. There's the peribrachial nucleus, which is another incredibly important nucleus, so nucleus tractus solitarius. And so this is, again, brainstem. And I highlighted these to show you something that is extremely important, is that these structures have an interaction, so as they move forward to one, they get a return response from the other. So there's a crosstalk which increases the complexity. Even when you try to pare it down and you go from the previous picture, which had all of these nuclei, now in this one I sort of reduced it to half a dozen, but even so the complexity is huge. Okay, now I wanted to show you, to be fair, the insular cortex and to tell you the part of the cerebral cortex that does deal with such things as pain. And here it is. When you look at the cerebral cortex from the side, there's just a little bit of red that points you to the insular cortex, which is deep. It's buried underneath other aspects of the cortex. And now I'm going to move forward, and you will see it coming through. And so you're literally, first you were looking at the transparency, and now you're looking at a cortex that is buried because we have taken out actually, Hannah, my wife, did in her lab. She took out the right hemisphere of that cerebrum, and she exposed, and by the way, this is a human brain. It's not a drawing. It's a human brain done with MR imaging. And the insular cortex is right here. So it's, it's a respectable bit of real estate, but it's not huge like the rest of the cerebral cortex. And you can see the relations. This here is the cingulate cortex. This is the cerebellum. This is frontal lobe. This is parietal and occipital lobe. Okay. And here I'm showing you the structure in a real brain. Again, it's a bit like the comparison with the modern imaging. You took out the brain structures around, and you're showing the gyri of the insula, which are here. And these gyri are very responsible for having a re-representation and a more expanded representation of the body during aspects of emotion and feeling, including, of course, pain. Well, these are just images. These are the very first images that we did. This is PET scan showing the feeling states of happiness and sadness, and in showing the insular activation. But just one point that, again, talks to what I had mentioned earlier, the fact that even after you take out the insular, feelings persist. So you have feelings that are slightly different, less complex, but feelings survive insular damage. So the critical thing for feeling processes remains the brainstem structures. And we'll skip that. So the relative contributions of brainstem and the insula are that the upper brainstem provide the first full organism integration of body states. Insular cortices provide a more explicit map of feeling states than the brainstem can provide. Okay? Consequences of feelings, and this is all applicable to pain as well. Feelings force attention on the body conditions associated with them, as well as on the circumstances that precede and accompany them. Feelings open the way to learning of adverse as well as advantageous situations, and learning permits the anticipation of future scenarios and the planning of suitable behaviors. Feelings are sentinels and motivators. They confer benefits on the individual and evolutionary advantages on a species that would have been born without the possibility of pain signals, for example, would have been extinguished fairly rapidly. Feelings open the way for a higher level of homeostatic regulation driven by conscious deliberation. This is critical. So it's when feelings are incorporated in our greater knowledge and in our greater cognitive capacities, that feelings can be the vehicles and the promoters of very complex behaviors, including cultural behaviors. And that's where we go here. Feelings motivate cultural practices and instruments, and as such, cultures are extensions of the homeostatic apparatus, including, of course, the homeostatic apparatus of feelings. And feelings also monitor and negotiate cultural practices and instruments. This is very important. This is the sort of thing that I've been writing about more recently in a variety of papers and in my last book, The Strange Order of Things, is that not only are feelings critical motivators in order to get to certain kinds of cultural instrument, but feelings are also the signs and states of mental and biological function that allow you to monitor what is going on in a cultural practice or an instrument. So as you know, you can look, for example, at the current moment politically and socially is very interesting because it is actually very, very much dominated by a variety of emotive responses, a lot of them around such things as anger, that are promoted by social media and that serve to monitor and very often counterbalance or provoke certain states that are going on in terms of the social and political practices. We'll skip that. Very good. So I hope I've told you that pain really needs to be treated as a feeling, probably the paramount feeling next to pleasure, and that we need to make distinctions between the things that are very objectively measured and that have to do with our body structures and the physiology that is appreciable in the body, and then the kinds of things that have a mental expression in the form of feeling and which we have to distinguish from the fundamental emotive component. And I'm going to stop right here, and I presume we have a few minutes for questions, and I'll be happy to entertain them. Thank you.
So I believe we have a volunteer with the microphone to run around. Yeah? Are there any questions here in the room? Let's start with that. Okay, we have a question. Richard?
Dr. Damasio, thank
Yes.
you. In what you've discussed so far, I'm curious what you found or have observed in the use of feelings and emotions between two individuals. So in a small system versus the individual as a system or mass culture as a system. What findings or what interesting things you found?
So what you're asking me is whether things change, or whether, for example, my description of this phenomenon would change if instead of having one individual only, you would have two. That's a wonderful question. And I think the answer is that it would all depend on who those individuals are and what the condition is. It's interesting that because the interaction, especially the interaction at emotive level, can be extremely important. And I was just thinking, for example, in the case of pain, how you can have contagion that can go from one person to the other, and how you could, depending on the personalities of the two individuals in that dyad, you could actually have one person that had pain and was complaining of it, and induce in the other, in case the other would be of a suitable personality, things that would be pain-like. And how, on the other hand, if you would have somebody that would have pain but would be an active fighter against pain and having a sort of resisting pain and not complaining of it, how you could, again, influence another individual that would have pain and would feel obliged to reduce that pain because of that connection. So the reason why what your question is so interesting is that, first of all, we, more often than not, when we study biology, when we study psychology, we study one individual. And of course, you go through all the trouble of having the data corresponding to that individual in terms of age, in terms of intellectual level, and so forth. But we tend not to study individuals in groups. The reason is very, very obvious. It's much more complicated. But in the end, we live in groups. We live in families, or we live in groups that are at work. We don't live alone, fortunately. And because of that, there are lots and lots of signs, especially in the world, well, it's not just especially the world of emotion. It's the world of emotion and feeling, and also the intellectual world. We're constantly influencing others. One thing, so I have not, to my knowledge, in all my years of work, we have not done any work ever with two individuals at the same time. Although, curiously, at this time, we're planning to do studies of how people respond to musical stimuli by having several people. We're planning to have as many as 15 people listen to the same musical stimuli at the same time. But you realize the complication of this, because, first of all, you have to have an apparatus to measure results, to measure changes, not in one person, but in 10 or 15 at the same time. The complication is, of course, much, much bigger. But the reason why it's important, and again, the reason why your question is so intriguing, is that, for example, when you go to a concert, you realize that the reactions that people have are individually to the way the music is being played. No question about that. But then there's another layer of phenomena that comes from the contagion that you have from people in an audience that can make an audience respond even more strongly or not to certain stimuli. So I think that your question has to do mostly with the future more than with the past. So maybe if you invite me in 5 years, I'll be able to tell you something. But it's not going to be about pain, it's going to be about music.
All right, and so it is officially break time.
Oh, she has a question there.
There's actually actually 3 more questions.
Oh, fine.
So I guess what I would say is if you need a break, to go ahead and go. But if you're okay answering a couple more questions.
I'm fine.
If that works for everyone. Okay, because there's also, actually, even, I think before you, Kate, there's a question over here.
Okay.
Excuse me.
I'm ready. You have a loud voice. Yeah.
Okay.
No, he has the microphone.
Oh, okay. So my question is, have you investigated the physiological aspects of what I would call the meaning response, which is also sometimes called placebo and nocebo responses?
No. The answer is no. But again, it has to do with 2 things that I talked about, and one of them is when I mentioned pain that would not be caused by a wound, but would be caused by what one would describe in quotes psychological trauma. The mechanisms that are at play there will also be at play with placebo. So it's ways in which you recruit from fundamental organismic responses. You recruit, for example, molecular responses that will produce the same result as something that would be given from the outside to cancel the pain. Again, it's part of this widening circle of understandings about this phenomena, about affective phenomena. Thank you.
Over here. Hi, Dr. Damasio. Thank you for your talk. I wrote down several things you said. One, feelings are reports to the mind on the state of life in an organism. And I think so much of what we're trying to do in this room is learn how to better help someone know the difference between an accurate report and an inaccurate report so they can engage differently in life in the presence of pain. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the underpinnings biologically might inform our choices as clinicians trying to help people.
Right. Well, I don't know that I can. I think in terms of how you do that, you're the person who knows how to do that. I think the important thing is to know you're the expert. I'm learning from you, but the important thing is to be aware of the interplay between what you call mind and what you call physiology. And there was something I said at the beginning, probably a little bit too early, which is that mind is part of the physiology. The most important thing that you have to remember, maybe this will help, is that mind and the physiology of the body are not 2 separate worlds. Mind is just a part of the general physiology that allows us to have mental representations, but it is all pulled up from the fundamental physiology. So you're really dealing not with 2, it's not mind and body, which is, by the way, the traditional way. And what I'm saying is a different way of looking at this phenomena, which I think is probably going to become quite standard, but right now it's not standard. Right now most people make these distinctions, and sometimes they even make the distinctions without noticing they're making them. And you talk about mind and brain, or mind and body, as if they were different, but they're not. It's just it's the complexity that is different, and the thing that is so important is that we happen to have a nervous system inside a living body. And that nervous system has the possibility of collecting information about the living body and information about the outside world, and interrelate the 2. But it is all part of the body. So whatever we have in mind is necessarily in the body. Couldn't be anywhere else. So it is in the body, and it is in the nervous system. And the nervous system is not operating alone, but in partnership with the body, which is the other thing. Again, this talks to your question on placebo and also to the first question, is that these things are in constant interaction. The other thing that is very important and which I have highlighted in my work, for example, my work on consciousness, is that most people think of the nervous system as separate and the mind as a product of the nervous system alone. But that's actually not accurate at all. Our minds are constructed in partnership with the body. Our minds are constantly in this immersion in feeling. Why? Because we are constantly having two kinds of report. A report that comes to the nervous system from the body, and the report that comes from the nervous system from the outside world. So I am seeing you, and I'm talking to you, and I'm here in this room, and what I see and what I appreciate and the questions you ask me and so forth, all of that is entering my mind from the exterior and entering through my senses, hearing, sight, and so forth. But at the same time, all of those percepts are influencing the state of my body, and the body is responding to that into that same mind. So at any given time, my mind is made of things from the outside of my nervous system and from the inside of my body through the nervous system. The nervous system is the broker. But this is a very different picture from the picture of the mind-body problem that we inherited. And this is the new way of seeing it, seeing these processes. And that's why anything that can happen to us in the outside world can have an effect in our interior and vice versa. You know, you may be fine and dandy, but if you're dying with cancer, you're not fine and dandy, okay? All things being equal, okay? Thank you.
Are you okay with one more question?
Sure.
Okay, so we did have a question online. Jason, I'm so sorry. Okay, well, yeah, I'll make sure to get you next time. So we did have an online question.
It's from Karen Lipsky.
Hold on.
Oh, let's see. She has a question. Let me pull it up on here again. I am interested in the discussion around the sense of loss around the loved one and how that can cause pain equal to tissue damage, if I heard correctly. Can you speak to the sense of loss of a life you thought you were going to have, but the pain robbed you of that life, and now you are left with the sense of loss to perpetuate your persisting pain?
Yeah, well, what I just gave in my last answer should be helpful to address that question. So it speaks to the point that when you have a loss, which is of course registered mentally first of all, that will have an impact in the organism, in the interior, and it can place the interior in situations of loss in the true sense. Now it's loss physiologically as opposed to loss mentally. And those changed physiology responses will be then registered as pain, as discomfort, as suffering. So it's the fundamental is in my previous answer, is that these two worlds, the world of the interior physiology, the one that can give rise to pain quite naturally, is not separate from the world of our cognition, where an event can have the same, can be perceived as such a profound loss that it then has an affective repercussion, and that affective repercussion is going to change the fundamental physiology. So it's all part of the same world. It has to do mostly with where it begins, is where the initial event begins. Is it a knife wound or is it a loss of love? but fundamentally you end up in the same thing, which is our physiology. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for answering all of those questions. So everyone, we have 5 more minutes of break. So get up, stretch your legs, wiggle around. There's coffee cart in the hallway if you need some caffeine. And then be back here right at 11 to start with the next lecture, please.
I am a fan in a group. Are there books? Yes.
Will you get him to do that if you want me to? No, it's perfect.